It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. An inspiring speech at Sunday's Golden Globes has the country abuzz over a potential presidential run by Oprah Winfrey in 2020. Voices across the spectrum, from the writer Sean King to the neocon Bill Kristol, have voiced their support. Winfrey's circle has even stirred the pot, telling reporters that she is actively considering it. Even President Trump has weighed in, saying that Oprah would be a lot of fun. Well, my next guest has a different take. Briahna Joy Gray is a contributing editor at Current Affairs, co-host of the podcast Something's Wrong on the Internet, or SWOTY, and an attorney. And her new piece for The Guardian is called Oprah Winfrey for President, The Idea Reveals an Uncomfortable Truth. Bri, welcome. What is that uncomfortable truth?
Well, that uncomfortable truth is that the Democratic Party has shown a great deal of hypocrisy in terms of who they think makes an adequate candidate for president. And what this revealed to me is not so much whether or not Oprah is a legitimate, possible, or desirable candidate, because we don't know very much about her actual politics at this stage. But what we do know is that the same justifications that are being used to say that she should run are those that were used against Bernie Sanders, and the opposite of those qualities, which were said that qualified Hillary Clinton to be the candidate in 2016. Specifically, what we saw in 2016 was a lot of, but she's so qualified, as the main reason why Hillary Clinton should be the candidate above all else, and why anyone who would support Bernie Sanders was doing so out of some ulterior motive, oftentimes sexism. And we saw this in the famous dust-up in which Hillary Clinton actually first impugned Bernie Sanders' qualifications. And he came back in his speech and said, well, what about all of these other qualities that make Hillary Clinton unqualified? For example, her judgment decision-making, including in her vote for the war. And he was attacked by the press and Hillary supporters for that comment. And it was characterized as him being sexist in diminishing her qualifications by virtue of being a woman, instead of based on the very policies and the decisions that he had specified.
Right. And you point out in the piece that we don't know anything about Oprah Winfrey's actual policy stances, right? She's never taken much of a position on critical political issues. So what do you think accounts for this immediate burst of enthusiasm across the spectrum, as I pointed out, for another celebrity candidate to take on our celebrity president?
Well, I think a lot of people are very frustrated, understandably, and hurt and at kind of their wits' end about Donald Trump. And there's a sense that, well, wouldn't this be poetic justice to fight fire with fire in this instance and get a bigger, badder, richer celebrity? And there's this sense that if people are justifying Trump's candidacy by saying things like, well, he's a billionaire, so he must be a good businessman, which means he must be able to run the country properly. Well, then to find the richest woman in America, or one of the richest self-made woman in America, at least, and kind of challenge his own mythology as a self-made man, which of course we know isn't true. He started with $1 million of seed money from his own father. But Oprah seems to be someone who can go toe-to-toe and match and exceed his own mythology. I think the problem with that, though, is that Democrats and Republicans are treated very differently. And if we think that Republicans are going to accept, or even moderates are going to accept from Oprah Winfrey what they accepted from Donald Trump, I think that is a mistake. Already, immediately the day after, we saw on Breitbart headlines talking about billionaire Oprah Winfrey gives a speech about racism or something like that, with the subtext being that the fact that she's a billionaire makes her out of touch. And even though that's silly, considering that Donald Trump is someone who literally has a gilded parlor and I believe a golden toilet at one point, it's what we're going to see, I would imagine, if this actually happens, is a lot of clips of Oprah Winfrey's magazine on which she's the cover model every single issue. We're going to see her talking about, growing her own zucchinis in her garden and, and not more substantive and problematic comments about her frustration with giving money to public schools, for instance, because she feels like the kids there aren't grateful the same way that the schools that she funds in Africa are. I mean, her public record is long, and there's a lot there to pick from to criticize. often unfairly, potentially unfairly. But there's also a lot there that is unknown about her actual politics and policies. And as a leftist who doesn't even want a Hillary redux, who wants someone who's more progressive, I've seen nothing to indicate that Oprah Winfrey is that person.
Right. You've been very vocal on the role of identity politics in the left and the issues that emerged around that from the primary as a supporter of Bernie Sanders. You wrote a piece, if I recall, a few months ago for Current Affairs called How Identity Politics Can Be Used as a Weapon Against the Left. I wonder if you could explain that and how you think that might fit into this current hoopla here over Oprah.
Well, I think that we're in a cultural place right now where the Democratic Party, having moved away from labor, kind of adopting the mantle of a third-wave Democrats, has been able to hold on to its appearance of liberalism largely by giving lip service to racial and gender and sexual orientation identity markers. So without, your one is able to seem like a liberal progressive person without offering any changes or threatening the status quo in any way. If you say, I support gay marriage, I support transgender bathrooms, I believe in intersectionality and know how to say that word as a buzzword in the midst of a speech, when in reality, you're not doing anything to shift the material conditions of the people who you're nodding to. So transgender people suffer some of the highest rates of homelessness and abuse. That's an economic, homelessness is an economic issue. Obviously, the material concerns of Black and Brown people in America have been at issue since we touched or touched soil or were brought here under duress. So this has manifested into and what it kind of came to a peak in 2016 was this way in which the candidate who offered fewer substantive material solutions and in fact in the past has supported policies, meaning her husband Bill Clinton's policies in the past that did a huge harm to Black and Brown communities, was considered to be the better candidate by virtue of the fact that she was able to signal in what people considered to be meaningful ways to Black and Brown communities. And also her gender, I believe, protected her from what were legitimate criticisms about perhaps not her personal stance on abortion, although she equivocated on that historically more than Bernie Sanders did, but her choice of a pro-life Tim Kaine as her VP. So we got into this place where supporting Sanders made you a racist and a sexist, including myself, by virtue of the fact that he was, a white man who also admittedly didn't always use language that showed how his economic message affected and benefited diverse communities.
Right, and this reminds me, on Monday I went to the funeral here in New York of Erica Garner, the 27-year-old activist and daughter of Eric Garner, and I was thinking about how difficult it must have been for her to come out in support of Bernie Sanders, which she did during the primary, while her grandmother, Gwen Carr, came out in support of Clinton, and many others in the mothers in the movement, the mothers of unarmed Black men killed, came out in support of Clinton. And I was thinking that had to be a tough decision because politically it would be advantageous to go with an established machine like the Clintons in some way because they have just so much more resources and a platform for your cause. But Erica Garner made a very principled choice to go with Sanders. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that as we wrap the pressures and the difficulties of being in that position and not going with the establishment.
Yeah, well, first I'd say that Erica Garner was a 27-year-old woman. So demographically, statistically, it's not unusual for her to have chosen Bernie Sanders. People, the media tends to erase the extent to which the majority of people under 30 of every demographic group, that includes minorities and that includes women, supported Bernie Sanders. So it's not that it's a surprise, but you're right to point out that it is politically brave insofar as the criticisms, even for people of color, for doing that were incredibly stark. And identity politics made it such that people were making arguments along the lines of, if you support Bernie Sanders, you're basically invalidating or quote unquote disenfranchising those Black voters, particularly Southern voters, who were so overwhelmingly in favor of Hillary Clinton. But what that argument ignores is that, especially for vulnerable people, especially for Black and brown people, especially for marginalized people, there is a real risk to not siding with the establishment, because we all know that the alternative, the Republican Party, offers the potential for so much more harm to us, that there's a larger extent to which I think that sometimes our communities are more risk averse. And that's truly what's driving the affinity for and the support for Hillary Clinton. So for someone like Erica, who belongs to several marginalized communities and who has been so personally marginalized and affected, to kind of shirk the olive branch of the Democratic machine and choose to support a party, a movement that is not as established, that has fewer resources, that can offer her potentially less support, really speaks a lot to her ideological commitment. And it's not something that should be brushed over.
Right, and finally, Bree, speaking of a lack of alternatives, I'm reminded of the fact that the Clintons attended Donald Trump's last wedding. Trump had previously voiced support for the Clintons, and also we're talking about Oprah versus Trump possibly in 2020. Well, Trump has also even previously floated Oprah Winfrey as his potential vice presidential candidate. This is Donald Trump back in 1999 speaking to CNN's Larry King.
Do you have a vice presidential candidate in mind?
Well, I really haven't gotten quite there yet.
I guess it's just
Oprah. I love Oprah. Oprah would always be my first choice.
Oprah.
Oprah, your competitor, right?
Oprah's a competitor.
You know what?
No
I'll tell you, she's really a great woman, though. She is a terrific woman. She's somebody that's very special.
So that's Donald Trump speaking to Larry King back in 1999 about he would want to make Oprah Winfrey his vice presidential candidate. Now, possibly looking at the prospect of squaring off against her in 2020. Bree, final thoughts as we wrap.
I think that quote speaks to the ideological wishy-washiness of both Donald Trump and Oprah Winfrey. Donald Trump transformed himself from a sort of kind of Democrat with racist inclinations, going back to his Central Park 5 vendetta, to a full-blown Republican who sometimes has to be prodded and reminded of what Republicans actually think and what their agenda is. And as I've mentioned before, Oprah Winfrey seems like America's friend, but she's somewhat of a blank slate. And the fact that she is loved by so many perhaps speaks to the fact that she has not been as forthcoming about what she actually believes, because taking a stand can be polarizing. So look, if Oprah emerges as the vanguard of the progressive left and is out here for $15 minimum wage and free public education and Medicare for all, then I might throw my hat in the ring as well. But I have some skepticism.
Briahna Joy Gray, contributing editor at Current Affairs, co-host of the podcast Something's Wrong on the Internet, and an attorney. Her latest piece for The Guardian is called Oprah Winfrey for President: The Idea Reveals an Uncomfortable Truth. Bree, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.